Andrew Breitbart Freedom Center tonight. Heartland Institute, for some of you that don't know what Heartland is, we are a 32-year-old national think tank, but we focus on state issues instead of totally national issues. We have 5 different areas, which I'm going to show you here real quick. We do 4 newspapers: budget and tax news, environment and climate news, we do healthcare news, and we do Constitution reform, but the issue that's most important to me, I think, is school reform news and educational choice, because if we don't fix our education system, we are never going to fix anything else in the country ever again because of the new kids coming through and being indoctrinated. So on the table, you will see copies of some of our education documents and education books. Feel free to take them. If there's not one there, over here on the left, there are plenty more copies. Feel free to pick up anything you want there. If there's questions you have, while Jason is up here talking, please write it down and ask when we get to the Q&A period. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A. A couple of quick reminders. On June 20th, Stephen Moore will be at the Union League Club, and we'll be hosting a brunch there with him. So see a staff member if you want more information about that. Also, our banquet is coming up September 15th. And on your tables, you'll see it, or on the P.J. O'Rourke will be our keynote speaker that night. So get your tickets early and come on out for that. In addition, if you want to take a tour, we have a library here, the Michael Perry Mazur Memorial Library. It has a little over 9,000 volumes, stretches from here all the way back into here behind us. You're welcome to come in during the week and actually sit back, and if you want to read some of the books we have here, we have a desk in here. You can sit there and read the books, any book you want while you're sitting here. During the event, you're going to also have a survey. I think some of you already have it. Please try to fill that out before the night's over and return it to a staff member so we can kind of get a feel for what's working, what's not working, if there's anything you'd like to see changed, if there's any topics you'd like to see us talk about. Please tell us what they are. It'll be great information. So now, so we don't keep going on everything else, I'd like to introduce Jason Bedrick of the Cato Institute, and he's a policy advisor for the Center for Educational Freedom. He's here to talk about education choice and how it's funded through different methods, and a little bit about Illinois. He knows a little bit about Illinois here, so we can get it, but he is also a former state legislator in New Hampshire. He now lives in Arizona and works for Cato in Washington, D.C. So let's welcome Jason to the stage.
All right. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just see if figure out how this thing works. Blaine, do I just call it out, or? Oh, there we go. All right. So before we get to that, so it's an exciting week to be here. We finally know who our presidential candidates are going to be, right? On the one hand, we've got a megalomaniacal left-wing authoritarian who supports socialized medicine and the public funding of Planned Parenthood, and on the other hand, we've got Hillary Clinton. So, or a third alternative, but today we're here to talk about today we're here to talk about our education system in this country, which for let's see if we can get. Sir, where do I point for this? There we go. So here's the status quo. Right? Essentially, we've had the same thing for more than 100 years. You've got students that move in what are called Carnegie units. They're put into a classroom based essentially just on the year that they were born. They progress based on the amount of time that they have sat there, no matter whether they've mastered the material or not. Year after year, and we assume that all students that were born in the same year are going to progress in all subjects at essentially the same rate. We don't make allowances for students by and large who may be behind in math but far ahead in reading and language, or vice versa. This is the system that we have, and this is a system that we've had for, again, more than 100 years. The status quo is essentially like the rotary telephone, which in its time was a remarkable device. It practically, if you had spoken to somebody 10 years before this was invented, they would have and told them that you could speak in real time with somebody that's on the other side of the planet, they would have thought you were describing magic. So it really is an incredible device. It does one thing and it does it well. But of course, we've moved far beyond that, in technology and in so many other areas of life, but education has sort of remained stuck in this rut. Where's the... So, in 1983, there was a report issued called A Nation at Risk, which said, and I want to give you the exact quote. Where am I supposed to? There we go. If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. So, a bit melodramatic perhaps, but it woke America up to the fact that we were no longer number one. We had fallen behind other nations. And as a matter of fact, there was a report, this is from the PISA a few years ago, that this is an international exam, this is a math exam, and it lays out the blue lines there are all of the other industrialized nations that take the exam. The orange lines are the US states. We've got Massachusetts over there doing fairly well, but to get to the US average, you actually have to go to the second page, where we are behind even number 30, and here is, there we go. There's Illinois, below average even for the United States. And you might think, well, okay, we're just not putting enough funding into these, right? Our school system is underfunded. But as a matter of fact, if you look at all of the countries that are in the top left quadrant, move too far. All the countries that are in the top left quadrant are nations that are spending less per pupil, but that are performing higher on the PISA than the United States, which is to say most countries in the world, in the industrialized world anyway, are much more efficient at educating their students. They have higher performance at a lower cost. So over time, there we go. The amount of money that we spend per pupil, and this is for an entire K-12 education, and these are in real dollars, so adjusted for inflation, $10, you see that it is about tripled since the amount that we spend per pupil since 1970, and yet we see that performance is flat. So there, the blue line is the total cost per pupil, again, adjusting for inflation, and then along the bottom is the test scores. So what's driving this? Well, to a great extent, it's actually staffing. So if you look at how much the enrollment, actually, let's go back on the slide there, the enrollment from 1950 to 2009 just about doubled student enrollment. And yet the amount of administrators and staff increased eightfold. Okay? Now, some of that has to do with special needs students, but if you even look just from 1992, long after special needs students were being integrated into regular public schools, you see that from 1992 to 2009, we had a 17% increase in student enrollment. But total administrators and staffs went up 46%. And you see that a lot of it is being driven actually by the administrators and other staff, not the teachers. The administrators, and in other words, non-teaching staff, is really what's driving this staffing bust, or staffing boom. Okay. So economists teach us that there are four ways that we can think about spending money. You can spend your own money or somebody else's, and you can spend money on yourself or spend it on somebody else. Now, somebody who is spending their own money has a strong incentive to economize, and somebody that is spending money on themselves has a strong incentive to maximize value. Unfortunately, our public school system is this category 4 spending, which has a weak incentive either to economize or to maximize value, because you have bureaucrats that are spending other people's money on other people. It's just the nature of the system. And of course, students are assigned to public schools based on the home that their parents can afford, which means that those parents who are fortunate enough that they can either afford to pay private school tuition, or they can live in a school district that has a higher performing school, and lower income families tend to be stuck in school systems that on average are not as high performing. So what do parents want? Well, There was a national poll in 2014 by the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice that found if you ask parents, if money was no object, right, you could just choose to where you would send your child, where would you send your child? More than a third, almost 4 out of 10, say that they would send their child to a public school, and even a few more say that they would send their child to a private school, and then about 10% say that they would homeschool or send their child to a charter school. But here's what they actually get. More than 80% send their children to their assigned public school. Fewer than 10% are sending their children to private schools, and then some are charter and homeschool. So here they are side by side, right? So you can see that the American public is not getting what they want. All right, so just to break it down, the state of public schooling, we've got flat, mediocre performance, increasingly expensive, less efficient, falling behind internationally. Low-income students generally lack access to a quality education, and parents in general are not getting what they want. So what do we do about it? Well, we could build a wall and make the Mexicans pay for it, or we could follow Milton Friedman's advice. Milton Friedman, who said decades ago, education spending will be most effective if it relies on parental choice and private initiative, the building blocks of success throughout our society. What he was talking about was a school voucher system, where he said there is an economic case to be made that the government should be involved in the financing of education to make sure that we have a quality of opportunity. But that doesn't mean that the government has to be the one running the schools. It would be much more efficient if the private sector were to run the schools and if families were able to choose the school that best met their child's individual needs. So what the voucher system does is essentially moves you from this category 4 to category 3. So parents are still spending other people's money, right? But they are spending it on themselves. And so now they have an incentive at least to maximize value. So, was Friedman right? Oh, yeah, it just shows how it works if we can slide all the way through it. Oh, there we go. So we get the district schools out, and the money goes to the parents, and the families get to decide. There we go. A few people I recognize. All right, so there's been a lot of research on this. Every study that's represented on here is what's called a random assignment study. This is the gold standard of social science research. Sort of like in medicine, you take a group of people, you randomly divide them into two groups. One you give the treatment, the other you don't, and the difference in outcomes in those two groups is attributed to the treatment, right? So people will apply for a voucher. There's oversubscription, there's a lottery. Some people by random chance will get a voucher, some by random chance will not. We can now compare these two groups, and it's an apples to apples comparison. Almost every single study, actually every single study before this year, found a positive outcome for some or all students, either for all on average or for certain subcategories like African Americans, low-income families that are the most choice deprived. And there was one study that found no visible effect. If we have time in Q&A and you're interested, maybe we can get into why these two studies found that in the first 2 years of Louisiana's voucher, they actually found a negative impact, which was surprising given the decades of research that found the opposite. In short, that program was not at all devised according to Milton Friedman's vision for a voucher system. It had lots and lots of government regulations that were intended to produce positive outcomes and may have actually undermined how that system worked. But we also have a lot of research on the impact on the local public schools, because there's this argument that, well, if we're going to give money to families directly and let them go wherever they want, then the families that are the most interested in education are going to leave the public school system. They're going to take the best students with them, and the public schools are going to be left with the hardest to teach students and with less money to do it. And isn't this such a terrible thing? That's one possibility that could happen, and so there's been more than 24 studies looking at this, and all of them found that there was a positive effect on the test score performance of public schools that were subjected to competition as a result of a school choice program. Usually it was a very modest improvement, but statistically significant in every case except for one which didn't find any statistically significant difference. That one is Washington, D.C., where the money does not actually follow the child. There is a separate bucket of money, right? So the public school system is going to, if 100 students or 1,000 students leave, the public school system gets exactly the same amount of money that they had before those students left, and the taxpayer pays for those students to go somewhere else. So you might be surprised that a principal would say, oh, well, we have fewer students to teach. That means we have fewer costs. And if we had crowded hallways before, they're a little less crowded, but we're going to get just as much money. You might be surprised that they actually don't change anything as a result of that because there isn't actually any competition. So now we're going to get into what's called the Blaine Amendment. James Blaine was a U.S. Senator from Maine and the Speaker of the House before that in the late 1800s, who was vociferously anti-Catholic. He was part of the Know Nothing movement, and in those days the public school system was essentially de facto non-denominational Protestant schools. Any Baptist, Episcopalian, Congregationalist, what have you, could feel comfortable sending their child to public school knowing that they were going to pray in school and they were going to learn the Bible in a manner that all Protestants essentially would be happy with, but not Catholics. And the schools really were meant to Protestantize Catholic immigrants, especially the Irish and the French. The rum Romanism and rebellion that they were bringing with them had to be squashed. So this is a famous cartoon by Thomas Nash showing the mitre gators of the Catholic bishops coming ashore, and here's this man holding the Bible, protecting his children from these devious papists. And so they tried to pass a national amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would have prohibited the public funding of sectarian schools. And everybody understood that sectarian was a euphemism for Catholic. Even they couldn't outright say it, but that's what it meant. That failed, but they did manage to pass something very similar in almost every state constitution. In fact, most of the Western states, as a condition of joining the Union, had to include a Blaine Amendment, along like with Utah, no polygamy or anything like that. So here's yours. I won't read the whole thing, but neither the General Assembly, et cetera, or any public corporation shall ever make any appropriation or pay any public fund, whatever, anything in aid of any church or sectarian purpose, or to help support or sustain any school, academy, seminary, et cetera, right? So public funding of religious schools, it seems to be out of the question, at least directly. Now the question is, what about a voucher? The voucher is going to a parent, and the parent is deciding to send their child to the school of their choice, which could be a secular school, could be a religious school. So how many in the room think, based on this, vouchers would be constitutional? Or I should say, using a voucher at a religious school would be constitutional? Nobody. How many would think it's unconstitutional? A lot of people. The answer is, we don't know. It hasn't been tested. It has to go to the Illinois Supreme Court. The Institute for Justice, which has fought cases like this all across the country, says here in Illinois it should be ruled constitutional following First Amendment jurisprudence. What this might only be prohibiting is the direct funding of such institutions. For example, you can use state Medicare dollars at a Catholic hospital. This might, as long as you can use it a wide variety of vendors, and some of those vendors just happen to be religious, no harm, no foul. This is it is indirect and it is incidental to the decisions of the beneficiary, but others might say otherwise. So we don't know here in Illinois, but there's something called a scholarship tax credit. And the way it works is this. The taxpayers, whether individuals or corporations, make a donation to a nonprofit scholarship organization, and these nonprofit scholarship organizations fund children attending the school of their choice. And the donors will get a tax credit, not like just the deduction that you have here in Illinois, but an actual tax credit. So the tax credits around the country range from anywhere from 50% to 100%. So let's say you had an 80% tax credit here in the state. You'd make a $1,000 donation. Let's say you had a $1,000 tax liability. That would now be reduced $800. So you would have a $200 tax liability after your $1,000 donation. So there are almost a dozen states, or almost 20 states now that have similar laws like this. Just the number of school choice programs, the growth in the last decade has actually been tremendous, right? So in about the last decade, we've tripled, and even in the last 5 years, we've doubled the number of school choice programs. That means vouchers, tax credits, and education savings accounts, which we'll get to in a minute. And the reason I brought up the tax credits was because the funding is never going into the public treasury, right? Because it goes from a private donor to a private scholarship organization to private citizens for the use of their children at private schools. It never enters the public treasury, so it does not implicate the Blaine Amendment. Their tax credit programs around the country have a 100% record of being upheld as constitutional thus far, even under several Blaine Amendment challenges. So that is always an option to expand school choice in your state. Here's just the states all across the country. You do have that blue dot, which is the individual deduction, but the deduction programs are very weak. We found that they essentially help lighten the load for parents that are already going to send their children to a private school, but they don't do much in the way of actually expanding educational opportunity. So it's something, but really not that much. But you see that these other types of programs are proliferating around the country. Even just this year, Maryland enacted a very small voucher program, and South Dakota enacted also a very small tax credit scholarship program, but it's a start. And the growth in the number of students has actually been tremendous as well. I mean, by a factor of 10 just since 2001. But again, this is still a very small percentage of students nationwide. But we have been seeing a lot of growth in this area. Most of that growth, or actually I should say a plurality of that growth, is coming from the tax credits. There are more students receiving tax credit scholarships than vouchers right now, even though the voucher idea is a much older idea. So, Milton Friedman, in an interview several years ago, just a few years before he passed away, he said, "How do we know how education will develop? Why is it sensible for a child to get all his or her schooling in one brick building? Why not let them spend part of a voucher for math in one place and English or science somewhere else? Why can't a student take some lessons at home, especially now with the availability of the internet?" Hence was born the idea of the education savings account, which I understand Joe Bast here, the president here at Heartland, was talking about when you wrote an article. You didn't call them ESAs, but back in the 1980s, right? Nobody listened to him then. If only we had listened. But these are restricted use bank accounts that parents can use for a wide variety of educational expenditures, including private school tuition, but not exclusive to that. You'll see what I mean. This moves us close to Category 1 spending. Now, it doesn't get all the way there, but it's superior to the voucher in this sense. A voucher is essentially a coupon. So if I get a $5,000 voucher, I have to spend that entire amount in 1 year, in one place, right? So don't really have a strong incentive to economize. No private school is going to put their tuition below $5,000 if people are running around with $5,000 vouchers. So it essentially creates a price floor. And if it were widespread enough, we fear that it could actually create the same sort of tuition inflation we see with the Pell Grants in higher ed. And that also wouldn't be great. But if I could take that $5,000 and spend it in multiple places and save whatever I have left over from year to year, now, even though technically this money came from somewhere else, because I can spend it in multiple places and save it for later uses, it's almost like I'm spending my own money because I have an incentive to economize in that sense, right? So we'll see downward pressure on price. It's less likely to create tuition inflation, and you can start to unbundle the system and create more efficiencies. So here's how it works. I'll just give you, Arizona was the first state to adopt an ESA. They now have them in Florida, Tennessee, Nevada, which one am I missing? Mississippi. So there are 5 states now that have ESAs. All of them right now, 4 of them are just for students with special needs. Arizona is students with special needs plus, and Nevada is the only one that's for almost every student. It's really any student that had attended a public school for at least 100 days in the previous year, but that currently is tied up in court. The ACLU and a whole bunch of groups filed a lawsuit, 2 lawsuits actually, one wasn't enough, and so those are actually going to be heard this year in the state Supreme Court, so hopefully we'll have that wrapped up before next year. But here's how it works in Arizona. The state takes 90% of the funding that would have been spent on your child and puts it in a private bank account for your use. And there's a restricted use debit card that you can use that you can't run off to Caesar's Palace and use it there. You can only use it at approved vendors. And they keep 10%. So the state ends up saving money, but now you can use these funds wherever. In the first year, we did a study, myself and Jonathan Butcher from the Goldwater Institute, in the first year of the program. At the time, it was only special needs students that were participating. Now it's also students that are children of active duty military personnel or personnel who died in the line of duty, students that are assigned to failing public school, students that are living on a Native American reservation, and a few other categories like that. But for the purposes of this satisfaction study, we were asking families that had students with special needs. A lot of them, about a third, had multiple disabilities, about another third had developmental delays, but it really spanned the spectrum. And because in Arizona, they weight the funding by special needs. So for some of these students, they might be getting, $6,000 or $7,000, but for others that, let's say, were blind or had other severe disabilities, they might be getting around $20,000 a year. Still less than what they would have been getting had they gone to a public school, or less than that would have been spent on them, but a significant amount. So one of the first things we asked them was, how are you using your funds? So 2/3, you notice that this does not add up to 100% because you can spend it in multiple places, but 2/3 were spending it on just private school tuition or private school tuition plus some of these other things. And about 1/3 were completely customizing their child's education. Not surprisingly, for a special needs student population, you had 40% that were purchasing education therapy, but also you had tutoring, homeschool curriculum, textbooks, we'll get to other in a second, testing fees, college expenses. Nobody decided to, but they could have taken discrete public school classes. You can't enroll your child at the public school, but you can pay for individual classes. So let's say that there was an AP calculus class at your local public school and you wanted your child to take it, you could pay the school and take just that one class if you so chose. Other things included karate, for example, to fill physical ed, going to a field trip to the Arizona Science Center, taking classes there, all sorts of things. Speech therapy, swimming therapy. And we asked those parents, now any parent that participated in the program had to have enrolled their child in a public school previously. So we asked them what their experience was, how satisfied were they with their previous public school. Fewer than half said they were satisfied. Only about 1 in 5 said that they were very satisfied. By contrast, this is the unicorn of public policy. This is the government program that has a 100% satisfaction rating. I sense some skepticism. Some of you are saying, well, of course, you're giving something away for free. Why wouldn't they be satisfied? But I will remind you that they're going to public school for free too. And fewer than half of them were satisfied. So it turns out if you give them less money than you would have spent on them, and that's just 90% of the state funding, right? They don't get a dime of the local funds. So the taxpayer saves quite a bit of money. You give them the money directly instead of having somebody else spend it for them, and it turns out that they're much more satisfied with the results. And we broke it down by income. You'll notice that the lowest income families were the least satisfied with their previous public school system. And, oh, too far. And the most satisfied, there it is, with the ESA, right? So it was the lowest income families, the families that are the most choice deprived from the start, that benefit by far the most from an education savings account. So we move essentially from the rotary phone to the iPhone, right? This is a platform for innovation. One of the great things about the iPhone is that it's so many different things that Steve Jobs never imagined it was going to do. I heard not too long ago that there's a device you can plug into it. It's an otoscope. You stick it into your child's ear. So one day in the future, instead of taking your sick child, putting him in the car, driving him to the doctor's office and sitting there in the waiting room with a bunch of other sick kids, you'll be able from the comfort of your living room to use Skype or FaceTime to directly get the doctor, and the doctor will be able to see inside your child's ear. Right? Steve Jobs never imagined that his new phone was going to do that. He created a platform for other people to experiment and find new ways of serving each other. And I can tell you already, I know many of the people who were involved. I haven't spoken to Joe about this, but I know many of the people who were involved in Arizona in devising the first ESA. They had no idea that people would be using it in some of the ways they're using it today. For example, students that have, now I'm going to, I'm spacing on the particular disorder that they have, where they're not able to, cerebral palsy, where they're not able to walk well. You know, their motor skills are highly impaired. And there's a family, there's a video from the Foundation for Excellence in Education that interviewed a family who has a child with cerebral palsy who was doing equine therapy. Now, apparently, for these students, if you put them on a horse and teach them to ride a horse, it helps rewire their brain, and it helps them actually walk. And they have a video of this child playing on a playground as the parents are describing how they never thought this child was going to be walking normally, never mind playing on a playground, and they're in tears. Now, I can tell you that the people who invented or devised the ESAs had no idea that anybody was going to be doing equine therapy. But here we have a platform for real education entrepreneurship that's going to create more efficiencies and improve performance. So the promise of education, of ESAs in particular, are greater educational opportunity for the poor, parents get what they want, improved performance, greater efficiency, greater innovation. So with that, I am happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Just raise your hand. Lindsay will come around with the microphone because you're live streaming, so we'll need the microphone to pick up that as well. So just raise your hand and Lindsay will come see you.
I don't know.
Sure.
Let me disclose I'm a strong supporter of voucher schools and free markets, but I think there is an issue that is so often raised about the concerns of charter school, which is the ability for charter schools to select their own students. And I think you mentioned some data that shows that maybe there is not quite a selection process at this point, but I think down the road we might run into the risk of having these high quality charter schools, like the Harvard of the charter school, who will become more selective. So how can we address that potential risk?
First, nothing that I was talking about were the charter schools. Charter schools are public schools. They are entirely publicly financed, and they have to be secular. You can't have a Catholic charter school, for example. And the charters cannot, by law, select their students. If there's oversubscription, the charter schools have to hold a lottery. But most voucher programs don't do that, like you say. Most voucher programs do allow schools to be selective. Now, if we were to interfere with this is one of the things that they did in Louisiana. Louisiana, they said, first they have price controls. Well, we want to make sure that low-income families have access to these schools, so we're going to put a cap on the amount of money that they can spend. Now, Milton Friedman, decades ago, said this idea is ludicrous. You're telling me that these parents can spend as much money as they want on booze and cigarettes, but they can't spend 1 penny more on their child's tuition, right? This is crazy. But they said, well, we don't want schools to be charging out of their price range, and we don't want them to be selective. So if a school is going to accept vouchers, they have to have a random lottery. And they did a few other things. You have to take the state test, which means essentially you have to teach according to the state curriculum. And what happened? 2/3 of the private schools in Louisiana said, we're out. We're not going to accept vouchers. And so the 1/3 that were left, it seems there's some suggestive but not conclusive evidence that the 1/3 that were left were the most desperate. There was a study that if you compare the two groups, those that did not participate to those that did, the private schools that were not participating had slightly increasing enrollment over the last decade on average, and the private schools that were participating had significant decrease in enrollment, right? So they were seemingly more willing to accept whatever regulations that were put on them. And so those low-income kids didn't end up, when we tried to regulate for quality and enforce this quality system for low-income students, what ended up happening is the students didn't have access to those quality schools either. Schools have admission standards for a reason, and I don't think we should be interfering with that. But the great thing is that in the market, there are lots of schools that want to appeal to all students. There are a lot of mission-based schools. A lot of them are Catholic. Believe it or not, I attended a Catholic high school. But a lot of these schools have a mission to go out and find those students that are in the toughest neighborhoods, that are the hardest to teach. And we want to encourage that. So I would just, I think we should exercise caution when it comes to interfering with the inner workings of private institutions. Next.
Yeah, sure. If I can maybe just add something to that. Sure. The public schools in Chicago, the best high schools, are highly selective. So it seems to me very strange that people are complaining about charter schools being selective when the public schools exercise that all the time. Right. And let me just go on to the point I wanted to make. Probably in the interest of time, you couldn't address every issue, but you made a good argument in favor of tax credit scholarships for religious schools, but then the education savings accounts and the use of the funds in the education savings accounts would be subject to the same Blaine Amendment issues that vouchers are. And so has that issue been addressed yet?
Yes, it's in the process of being addressed. I'll get to that first. You remind me of something. I've been using the term public school over and over out of force of habit because everyone understands what a public school is, but really there's no such thing as a public school, right? You have district schools, and these schools serve every student that lives in a particular geographic area. But this week, the Sun Sentinel in Florida reported that the Broward County School Board is hiring private investigators to go and monitor. Yeah, go ahead. You have something to add to that?
I'm sorry. I have
Yeah.
a testimony, and I definitely have to share it. So,
Sure.
I have a friend that's currently living in Maywood, Illinois, and in an effort to keep her daughter out of, I guess, quote unquote, crappy schools, what she did was, I shared this story with Winnie Jarrett. What she did was she used her sister's address so that her daughter can attend a better school district in Broadview, about 10, 15 minutes away. She received a letter in her daughter's backpack that said, your daughter should not return to school. It is unlawful that she's in this school district. Mm-hmm. My friend got devastated. She then turned over to the president of the principal of the school to try to fight it. They put her in some kind of hearing. Ultimately, the first grade student was able to finish out the school year and do her graduation ceremony, but she cannot return back, and they have fined my friend over $2,000
Right.
for sending her daughter to an out-of-district school. I would love for you to touch on that.
Privately owned shopping malls are more public than public schools. Okay, so yes, there are parents who have gone to jail. There's actually a woman who died in jail, after she went to jail because she was sending her child trying to get her child a better education, because we have a terrible system. And now the schools don't have the resources to hire a private eye for every single family that goes to the school. So how do you think that they're figuring out which families belong there and which ones don't? Maybe they're looking at what these students look like. Maybe they're not the same color as all the other kids who live in the district, right? So, sure. You work here. This is your place. So you invited me.
The main concern, since her and I have been having a conversation about that, the main concern is who's been following me, who's been stalking my.
Oh yeah.
You know
They're-
questions are
they've
kids
got-
aren't prompted to say, "Oh, I live at mom's house and such and such." Kids don't understand that. They're not cognizant of the risk, and it's completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
So the main concern is, how long have I been watched? Are you following me from my job to my home?
Right.
And it's utterly ridiculous.
Right.
All right, I'm done.
But on the second point, the ESA, yes. So there's two ways you can fund the ESA. All of the ESAs we have now are publicly funded. You technically could have an education savings account that's funded through tax credits. New Hampshire has something that's pretty close, where in New Hampshire, it's a tax credit scholarship program you can use at a private school or for homeschooling expenditures. So you can't do both. You can't use some of it for private school, some for tutoring, textbooks, homeschool curricula, online learning, etc. But if you choose not to go to a private school and homeschool, you can get a lower amount that you can use to cover all of those different things. I would like to see a tax credit system that is more like the ESA, where you could do private school plus, or entirely customize whatever the parent thinks works best for their kid. But as to the question of the constitutionality, if it is publicly funded, so in Arizona, this is the only place it's been challenged and decided so far is in Arizona. Years ago, the Arizona Supreme Court struck down the state's voucher program under their Blaine Amendment. But when it came back, when they challenged the ESA program, and this came back before the state Supreme Court, really it was a lower court decided this was that this was constitutional. It did not violate the Blaine Amendment, and the state Supreme Court declined to review the case. So it is constitutional Arizona. So what's the difference? They said that the difference was with the vouchers, the money had to be used at a school, and that most of the schools in the state were religious schools. And the court thought that this was essentially a subsidization of religious schools. They said with the ESA, it doesn't have to be used at a school at all. And in fact, we have research that shows about a third of the families were not using the money at any school. So they said, well, here you have a wide variety of different things that you could do with this. So we don't see this as something that is designed to subsidize religious schools. Although I'll say that in other states, even vouchers have been upheld under the Blaine Amendment along very similar lines, because they say, well, the ultimate beneficiary, we don't think of food stamps, the ultimate beneficiary is the supermarket. You think that the beneficiary is the person using the food stamps and eating the food, right? So they said the beneficiary is really the student, not the school, and they can use it at a wide variety of schools. Doesn't have to be religious, can be secular. So we're not going to do this bean counting test where we say, well, if there's 90% of the schools are religious, then we think it's a problem. But if only 50% are religious, then that's maybe okay. They said we're not going to count beans. So it depends on the state Supreme Court. It depends on precedent. But the Institute for Justice, which is fighting a very similar challenge to the ESA program in Nevada, is confident that they are going to prevail. So we'll see. Yep.
Which is along the commuter rail line, and we were told that district personnel would be at the rail station in the morning to watch who got off the train, see if they would attend my high school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
You've talked about the the existence of these large bureaucracies, educational bureaucracies, and even ignoring the federal department, each state is presumably in charge of education for its citizens. So how do you address the question of standards, the fact that we're maybe not competitive, and the question of compliance? So, you know, if we look at welfare and a number of other of these social transfer programs, there are some people who abuse these things. And so if you have parents who may say, well, it's okay for my kid to get enough education to be a bagger at Walmart rather than to study calculus, so let's take the money and you know, take them to the zoo every day. How do we deal with these questions? Because they'll obviously come up in a political circumstance.
Certainly they do, and not every parent is perfect. Actually, I haven't met a perfect parent yet, but I am one. Not a perfect one, a parent. You can ask my kids. But I also haven't met a parent that says, I really don't care about the education my kid's getting. Right? I think most parents care very, very deeply about the education that their kids get. We have a lot of evidence. Now, it's not going to be perfect. There's always, there are always going to be parents that, let their kids fall through the cracks. But by and large, those kids are already falling through the cracks, right? They're not going to be falling through the cracks more in a system of choice, right? I mean, let's say you had a system of choice like we do, in dozens of states. And although, again, they're very, very small choice programs, but you still have the public school system. So a parent that says, I'm not going to send my child to, I'm not going to go, investigate different schools and take an ESA or a voucher and send my kid somewhere else. I'm just going to leave them in the public school system. They're no worse off than they were before. And as a matter of fact, we've got all the research showing that they're better off, even if they don't exercise any choice. The very fact that they have the choice to go somewhere else, that they have that exit option, means that the public schools are working harder and more efficiently to meet those needs. And we have all this evidence that the public schools, on average, do better in a competitive environment. Not earth-shattering, not transformative, but these are small programs that are having small positive effects. So even if they're not exercising choice, they're better off. Now, I find it highly unlikely that a parent is going to say, well, you know what, instead of sending my child to the public school, I'm going to keep them home and I'm going to take them to the zoo or whatever. I mean, because they can only use those funds. They can't take the funds to Caesar's Palace, right? They can only use those funds on approved uses. Now, if we want to get into the weeds, there's some different types of accountability systems. So in Arizona, for example, they're looking at your receipts and things like that. And also, there's two types of vendor codes for these debit cards, right? So we don't have a system yet that has per product vendor code. Right now, they're per vendor codes. So you can go use it at Walmart, because at Walmart, there are a bunch of products that are approved, but there's also a bunch of products that are not approved. But that's where the receipts come in, because they're not going to get their next quarterly disbursement until they have sent in their receipts. And they have been a few families, very few, but a few, that were caught buying things that were not approved. Now, in a few cases, it was sort of like borderline gray area things. It was a mistake. They had to refund it. In one case, there was like a television or something. They had to refund it and pay a fine. Parents, real fraud, you can end up going to jail. So there are accountability systems, but you know what? There's fraud, waste, and abuse in the government system as well. Take a look at, there was a book recently called The Prize about the Newark, New Jersey public school system. I don't know if you remember, a few years ago, Mark Zuckerberg went on Oprah next to Cory Booker and Chris Christie and pledged $100 million to be matched by an additional $100 million. That $200 million was just basically flushed down the toilet. You can read this book called The Prize. Now, I thought when I picked up the book, I thought the prize referred to this $200 million. As a matter of fact, it refers to the $1 billion budget that the Newark City school system has for one of the worst school systems in the country, where they're spending north of $20,000 per pupil, where the central office is chock full of fraud, waste, corruption. The author describes that even clerks had clerks there, and yet they were frequently sending out report cards weeks or months late. In many cases, sending out report cards with the wrong students' grades attached to them, so the wrong kids were getting rewarded or punished, right? Just absolute incompetence for north of $20,000 per pupil. So is the system that I'm pointing to going to be utopia? Is it going to be perfect? Is it always going to produce great outcomes? No. But we have to compare these programs against the reasonable alternatives. And I think that the ESA and school choice generally is just miles ahead of the system that we have now. Question?
My question kind of segues from that, and it's the other side of the accountability issue. I am a homeschooling mom, and there are concerns in the homeschooling community about the accountability factor and the overregulation and interference of educating our children ourselves from the government.
So right now the existing programs have a very, very light touch. That won't necessarily always be the case, but the same is true for just homeschooling in general. I mean, any homeschooler that's familiar with the different laws around the country know that in some states it's very laissez-faire, and in other states, you know, if you're going to homeschool your kid, that's fine, but you need to file a plan with the local school district and they have to approve it, right? So regulations can come with or without these types of programs. But the sort of Louisiana-style regulations that come with the voucher program are very difficult, if not impossible, to do with an ESA, right? So I guess technically you could say, if you have an ESA, that any school that accepts ESA funds can't charge more than a certain amount, or must administer a certain test, or must have an open enrollment. But it would be sort of strange to do that because you can't do that with all of the other different things, right? So if you have a student in Arizona who decides to enroll in an online learning system, like the Florida virtual school or something like that, the state of Arizona can't tell the state of Florida how much to charge, how to run their admissions or anything like that. So either and likewise, you can't do price controls on every book, on every tutor, on every college course that these kids are going to take. And you can't really, like, all these, enrollment and whatnot, you really just can't have these regulations. It just simply doesn't make sense. The funny thing is, there are friends of mine in the movement who are a little more technocratic. They wear that as a badge of honor, who like the Louisiana-style choice system, who think, well, maybe it would have been really bad in the market, and these regulations actually improve things from what they would have been. Maybe, we can't prove it one way or the other, but at least not yet. We don't have enough data. But they look at the ESA and they say, wait a second, I'm not sure that we can regulate this the way we can regulate a voucher. And I say back to them, that's a feature, not a bug. So,
Real quick on
sure.
on the homeschool laws here in Illinois, we're one of the best homeschooling states in the country. There is really no regulation. You're considered a private school. So we don't have to do testing. We don't have to talk to the school district. We don't have to notify them. Oops, sorry. Okay. Now, okay, is it back on again? Okay. So, to reiterate, so we're picking up for the video, Illinois is probably one of the best homeschooling states in the country. There's really no regulations. You're considered a private school. There's actually homeschooling is not even mentioned in the state law. So, and a few years, it was like 4 years ago, they tried to register homeschoolers, and 4,000 homeschoolers showed up in the rotunda within a week. And so that's one of their best ways. So yeah, homeschooling Illinois is probably one of the most protected avenues right now in any of the states that you can get to right now. So.
Right, and eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, right? No matter what you do, you're going to have to be there. And if we have I don't think my mic's on anymore. Well, maybe it is. If we have an ESA program and you've got all of these parents that are invested in it, and somebody comes along years later and tries to tinker with it and add regulations, I think you've got a much better chance of getting families to organize and fight against it. Right. Question?
Yeah. Could you do a little more description of the New Hampshire ESA? The reason I ask is I have a son and his family who live in New Hampshire in Croydon. I don't know if you're familiar with Croydon.
I just wrote an op-ed about Croydon this week.
And they're being sued currently by
Yep.
the Board of Ed because they paid, I think, for 5 children to go to Montessori.
Yeah.
But the fact is, they're saving the school district $20,000 a year by doing that.
Right.
And they happen to have, I think there's a lawyer who lives in Croydon who has argued successfully before the Supreme Court in New Hampshire. So they feel that he's read the law, and they're not that doing Catholic school or private school, just private school in the sense of Montessori.
Yeah.
But how would that, I mean, wouldn't that be better than what they're trying to do?
Right. So again, New Hampshire doesn't have an ESA. It has a scholarship tax credit program. And right now it's pretty small. Donors, they don't have an income tax, so it's only corporate donors get an 85% tax credit. There are 2 scholarship organizations that are funding low and middle income kids to attend the school of their choice. And I did a satisfaction survey there, and it was north of 86% that were satisfied. Yeah, or that were very satisfied. It was closer to 95% that were very satisfied. That one is for low and middle income, so it's anywhere up to, I think, 300% of the federal poverty line. But what you're talking about is that there is one town, Croydon, New Hampshire, which has a population of, I think, less than 1,000 people, decided that, well, they didn't have a high school. They actually, I think, only have grades 1 through 4. And so they had for years been contracting with a neighboring town. And the school board and selectmen, before their contract was up for renewal, decided, you know what, instead of just paying a neighboring town to take our kids, why don't we give our kids up to that amount to go anywhere they want to go? And so there were a few students that decide, or families that decide they wanted to send their students to a local Montessori school, which charged less in tuition. If I have the numbers right, I think they were paying the neighboring town $12,000 per pupil, and they were spending about $8,000 per pupil at this school. So the taxpayers were saving money. The families were getting what they want. They were more satisfied. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that the governor and the state school board said, whoa, wait a second. We didn't give you the authority to do that. We don't want towns just deciding all over the place that they can just do this sort of thing. And, you know, we want to keep our monopoly. We don't want competition. And so they sued. And now the state, the town said, well, what law are we violating? And they really had a hard time pointing out, you know, like, well, you don't have the authority. And they're like, well, you know, why? You know, who says that we have to ask you? So this actually is in court right now. But just last week, the New Hampshire legislature passed a law explicitly stating that these towns do have the authority to create a program like that. We'll see what the governor does with that. I have a feeling she's going to veto it. Any other? Pleasure. Any other questions? Over here.
Could you make some comments on what's happening in Florida with regard to the lawsuit against the tax credits down there? Because the argument has been all along that because it's not government money, it's not going to be subject to regulation, it can't be attacked, but it looks like it got big enough in Florida that the opponents have said, well, we're going to attack it anyway.
Yeah, they waited 13 years before they filed the lawsuit against the program. And they've won at the lower court level, and that still has to go before the state Supreme Court. It's a slightly different challenge. I mean, I think they have a Blaine Amendment challenge over there as well, but I think the challenge that they're a little more worried about is what's called the uniformity clause. So most states have similar language to this that says that the state constitution says that the state legislature must create and fund a system of free, equitable, quality, uniform public schools, right? Now, what does this term uniform mean? Well, years ago, when they first had a voucher program, there was a lawsuit against the voucher program where the court said, well, uniform, that means that there has to be, like, uniform means exclusive. And so you can only have this one system of schools, and you can't have a parallel system of schools. And so the voucher system is funding a parallel system, and so we're striking it down. That's really ludicrous, because what about charter schools? And what does uniform mean? Does it mean that every school has to be teaching the exact same thing? Does that mean that the state has to be deciding the curriculum? Does that mean that they all have to be funded at the exact same level, that different towns and cities can't decide for themselves how much money to appropriate to give to their school? Right? Nobody really knows what uniform means, but the question is whether this system violates that. Now, the lower court said, nope, it's private money, it's a tax credit. This doesn't implicate the Constitution at all. Nothing to see here. We'll move along. And based on the precedent from every other state Supreme Court that has dealt with it, I think, and the U.S. Supreme Court for that matter, in 2011 decision, Arizona Christian School Tuition Organization versus Wynn, where the U.S. Supreme Court said, as long as the money has not entered the tax collector's hand, it is private funding, not public funding. Doesn't become the government's until the tax collector gets it, until it enters the public treasury. I have a feeling that they're going to rule in the same way as the consensus of the U.S. and every other state Supreme Court to address the matter, but you never know. Yep.
I don't know if you noticed, you're in Illinois. We don't care about the rest of the world. We've got our own problems.
Well, you actually do have precedent in your court system that dealt with your deduction program, where they said that this is private funding, not public funding. So
I hate to say it, but I think your ESA program is basically sort of a workaround. It doesn't.
The ESA or the tax credit? I think the tax credit, people have made that case.
They both don't address the issues we have in Illinois. In Lake County, I know of a grammar school that spends $37,000 per pupil per year.
Yep.
Okay? Cook County, Chicago, is how many billion in debt? I don't know. Okay? And some schools don't have toilet paper, is right.
Mm-hmm.
The issue isn't, can we get a tax credit? The people in Chicago can barely afford to put food on the table for the kids. We feed them twice a day. School funding in this state is a joke. You can spend $37,000 in one neighborhood, and 30 miles away spend $6,000, $5,000, and still have to give them free food. We've got bigger problems than getting tax credits and putting our kids in schools that we choose.
This is not a solution to all the problems in the world. So I'm not saying that you pass this and you're not going to have poverty anymore, and there'll be unicorns and rainbows and everything. But I am saying that it is going to be a significant improvement over the status quo. And just ask yourself, do you think that the school system that's spending $37,000 and not producing very great results, do you think they're going to spend that money a little more wisely when students suddenly start leaving that system and the money leaves with them? How do you think that these schools are going to respond when they are subject to competition? I think I look at it the other way. I mean, all of this tinkering that we've been doing from above, saying, well, let's make them take this test, and let's put this requirement on them and that requirement, and regulate them into quality, has failed. Hasn't worked. We hear this argument all the time. Well, you're going to send these kids with vouchers or tax credit scholarships to unaccountable private schools. And what they mean by unaccountable is unregulated, right? But those private schools are accountable. They are more accountable because they are accountable directly to those parents who have the option of voting with their feet and leaving at that school and going somewhere else and taking their money with them. Whereas the public school system, who's the public school system accountable to? The students? The parents? At best, the school board, which is elected by the union in an off-cycle election that nobody's paying attention to except the people that are very, very interested, like the unions. They're accountable to state bureaucrats, things like that. But they're not accountable directly to the parents. So we have to keep piling more and more regulations on top of them, and we find out that it doesn't work. We want it to work. We want the system to work. We need to make those schools directly accountable to the parents. How do we do that? By giving the parents a choice of where to go, by letting the money follow the child. And what we've seen is with small school choice programs, we've seen some small but statistically significant improvement. If we want to go big, if we want to have real change, then we need a system that's large enough that every family is able to go to the school, send their children to the school of their choice, or get the education of their choice. Moving, again, with ESAs, moving from school choice to educational choice, recognizing that not all education takes place in a traditional classroom setting. So that's what's going to happen. If you want that iPhone version of education, you need to create a platform for education innovation in your state. And is it going to change everything overnight? No. Is it going to solve all of your problems? No. But I think it is, just as in so many other fields, the market has improved the system and improved outcomes for those participating in the system. It will too in education if we give it a chance. Time for another question?
Yes,
from
Jason.
Joe.
I'm trying to find a regulation that you might embrace.
Good luck.
Should parents be able to pay tuition from their ESAs to a Muslim school that teaches violent revolution?
Well, I'll take the Muslim out of it because, yeah, absolutely, I think they should be able to send their children to a Muslim school or a Quaker school or a Mormon school or a Jewish school or any type of school that they want.
Quakers and Mormons don't advocate revolution. Do you
Okay,
think
so
that they
then
should
there's the question of
include
revolution,
those?
but neither do most Muslims. But if you do have a school, now I keep hearing about the proverbial KKK school. I mean, this has been a question we've been having for decades. What if parents send their kids to a KKK school? Well, show me the KKK school. I mean, I haven't seen it. Maybe it exists somewhere. I haven't heard about it. You know, if this is a significant enough problem, you can put one line in the in the law that says that you can't use these funds at a school that teaches the radical overthrow of the United States government. You know, I guess, fine, if that's so necessary. I can imagine, though, that the British may have had a similar provision in colony schools when during the Revolution. So I come down if there's
So you're comparing the founding fathers to Muslims now.
I'm saying that I come down the side of freedom, even though the price of freedom is that some people are going to say, do, and believe things that I don't agree with, and that's the price. That's the price of freedom. It would be I think a small, simple fix if this was a significant enough. I think it's a red herring, is what I'm essentially saying. But if it is a significant enough problem that we really do see that there are these schools that are advocating violence, okay, we can draw the line at advocating violence. But why would we want to not have this program that has such great potential to improve educational outcomes for so many children just because of the remote possibility that a few people might be preaching something that they would be preaching anyway?
I agree. Well answered.
Just one more comment about Illinois. I went online a couple of days ago to take a look at per pupil spending among the 50 states. And this is admittedly a combination of local plus state spending. Illinois came in 14th among the 50 states in per pupil spending. Now, there's no question that some districts are hurting, but all you have to do is open the Chicago Tribune, and every few weeks you read about a school district that had an administrator that got an excessively high pension, misused money for personal reasons, high administrative personnel costs, and I'm not so sure that spending per pupil is the real problem in this state. It's the fact that we're stuck with a district system which is really a local monopoly that has the incentive to misuse public money.
Right, like I said, this is Category 4 spending, people spending other people's money on other people. The Cato Institute was actually the one that uncovered how much Washington, D.C. was spending per pupil. A few years ago, I think it was 2009, Andrew Coulson, of blessed memory, who passed away this year, was crunching some numbers and determined that the public school system in D.C. was spending about $30,000 per pupil, and which is more than double the national average. Right? Even other people in the movement, when he publicized these figures, said, "Andrew, please don't embarrass us. This is like tinfoil hat stuff. This is crazy, okay? No school could possibly be spending $30,000 per pupil, especially in getting the worst outcomes in the nation. I mean, if you look at the NAEP, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, which is known as the nation's report card, Washington, D.C. comes behind all 50 states. It's not a perfect comparison because you're comparing a city versus states, but still, these are low-performing schools, high dropout rates. So, but Andrew was adamant. He crunched the numbers. He brought it to the attention of the Census Bureau, which publishes figures, but they were publishing figures, a much lower figure based on the data that they were getting from the local school system. And Andrew said, hey, you notice that they're leaving out this category of spending when they report the figures to you, feds. And they leave out this category and this and this and this. And they said, well, let us crunch the numbers. We'll get back to you. And sure enough, there was about $29,000 per pupil, okay? So it's come down a little since then. Some of it was stimulus funds. But yes, if resources were the primary driver of educational quality, D.C. should have the best schools in the nation by far. But they don't. It's not about the resources. I would, again, if you have a system where there is real competition, no school system can afford to waste money like that. Because if they're doing a poor job and other people are doing better with less, parents are going to go where people are performing better, right? That's how the market works. That's how the market delivered you the iPhone. We want the iPhone education. Is that it?
All right, yep. We got a couple of house cleaning things here. Remind everybody,
you.
you have a survey in front of you. Please fill it out. Either give it to a staff member or set it on the table in the back. Remember, the books on the table are free. The books over here in the corner are free. Actually, there's a bookshelf over here. If there's a book you want, they're $1 a piece. So if you want to do some extra reading, feel free to pick up a book for $1. Want to remind you, next Wednesday night, we're having another event here. Next week will be on your Second Amendment rights. So if you want to come back out again next week, please do so. I just want to thank everybody for coming, everybody online, and let's give Jason a round of applause and thank him.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a good evening, everybody.